Good morning, AP Human Geography students. We have finished chapter 2, which is population. Now we're going to talk about the movement of people. And so we're going to look at chapter 3, migration, key issues 1 and 2. Where are migrants distributed? And where do migrants migrate within a country? So a couple terms associated with migration. One is the term migration itself, which is permanent movement. The second one is mobility, which is general movement between areas. Movement to activity spaces. So the difference between you going back and forth from school every day or back and forth from your church or your sports activity or anything else, that's mobility. That's not migration, right? Migration is a permanent movement, right? And then we have circulation, which looks like migration, but is really more of a mobility piece. And that is a cyclical pattern of mobility, right? For example, college students, right? There's a cycle that happens. They go to college in the fall, they return home in the spring, right? It is important to remember that migration has a massive effect on the people living in a place, who are already living in a place, the place itself, right? And most importantly, the people who are doing the movement. All right. There is no comprehensive migration theory, but we do have some principles that a guy named E.G. Ravenstein came up with in 1885, and he's going to talk about some motivations, and then particularly when it comes to the distance that people are willing to and are able to move. So let's take a quick look at these, right? First one, migration. Most migrants only go a short distance at a time. This is something called step migration. Where you're going to start in a spot, you're going to move to another spot, and your final destination is maybe 4 or 5 steps away through political things, borders, maybe refugee camps, things like that. All right, the second piece says that long distance migrations are for those who come from large cities, right? That people who already live in a city are more likely to migrate long distances, and they're most likely to migrate from one large city to another large city. Most migration, the third principle, most migration comes from rural areas to urban areas, people leaving rural areas and going to urban areas. You see this trend throughout the world. This one probably makes sense to you. He just came up with it in 1885, before any of us were alive, right? Our fourth one, most international migrants consist of young males between ages 20 and 45. This one's a little outdated as we see a growing trend of younger and more female migrants. And again, this is international migration. This isn't internal migration, right? Most migrations proceed in a step-by-step process. Again, that we look at short distances at a time, right? And again, we think about how people are willing to move, where they're willing to move. People are more likely to move to a place closer to them than a place further away. Next principle, each migration flow produces at least one counterflow, meaning that not everybody who arrives at a place stays at a place. They will often return to their country or their city or their place of origin where they started. And not everybody, but that does happen. There is a counter migration, a counter flow. All right. Next one says females remain more migratory than males within their country, that they move more than males do within their country, not internationally. Migration increases in volume as industries develop and transportation improves. That makes sense, doesn't it? Industry attracts jobs, which attracts people. And then transportation improvements are definitely going to help improve, right? It's going to not be such a barrier, right? And then the last one, which is ever so important, major causes of migration are for economic reasons. People tend to move for jobs. If there's one thing I want you to remember, and we'll get into this later on when we talk about push and pull factors, but economic reasons really, really drive people to move. And think about your own migration story during this time. Your parents may have lived here forever. Your grandparents may have lived here before that. But what caused your family to originally move to this area, because almost everybody, unless you're an indigenous person who has lived in that same spot for generations and generations and generations, has a migration story. What caused you to move to Cottage Grove or St. Paul Park? What caused you to move to Minnesota? What caused you to move to the United States, right? And largely, you're going to see economic reasons being a major factor. Right, so there's counter migration. Right, this is sometimes a policy. Right, government detaining and sending back undocumented workers. Right, Haitian boat people you see there on the right would be a good example of that. And keep in mind that these policies exist in a time, but they don't necessarily stay the same. So Haitian earthquakes allowed the United States didn't detain as many people, didn't send as many people back. When the Taliban came to power, people fleeing the Taliban were allowed into the United States under refugee status. They sought political asylum and they were received because the Taliban was a really terrible government for human rights. All right. Other things to talk about, Ravenstein comes up with something called the gravity model. Right? The interaction between places varies by population size and distance between places. Right? So it doesn't take into account push-pull factors of modern transportation, things like that, but it does say that distance matters, right? Size and distance between places. So if we look distance between this one and this one, right? You see size also figuring as well. So between the yellow spot and the green spot, you see, even though it's further away, right, you see a bigger migration push, right? So think about that just in terms of your own visiting. Many of you have been to Sioux Falls, South Dakota, but I would guess that more of you have been to Chicago. Even though Sioux Falls is much closer, people tend to go to bigger cities because of opportunities there. Now, that's not a movement migration piece, but it is something for you to think about just in terms of size. Right? Size figures into this. All right? Keep in mind, we also have something called distance decay that works with migration. Interaction with faraway places are generally decrease as distance increases. So the further away you get, from a place, the more distance between a place, we have something called friction of distance that happens, right? That you're less likely to have interaction with that place. You're less likely to have interaction with Sydney, Australia than you are with Chicago, Illinois. Right? And when we look at this in terms of migrants have less complete perceptions of places further away from them than places that are closer to them. They're more likely to move to places closer than their than their place of origin, right? And this again plays out in Ravenstein's laws as well, right? We have also something called Zipf's inverse theory law, which basically says the closer the distance, the more places interact, and vice versa, right? But Zipf does not take into account the size of cities. Larger cities tend to have more migrants, right? That this smaller place, yes, is going to have more interaction, right, with the blue area, but it might also have interaction with this one over here, right, because it's a bigger spot, right? So there, again, we look at migration volume affected by distance. So you're going to have more and more and more. All right, on to the migration transition model. This goes back to, I told you the demographic transition model was going to come back and see it, and right away we see it in chapter 3, right? So I hope that you learned the DTM because it really affects migration as well, right? So we have something called the migration transition, which a guy named Wilbur Zielinski pioneers that, and he basically says changes in countries' migration patterns are based on the stages of the demographic transition. So in stage 1 of the DTM, that's the hunter-gatherer, you see seasonal mobility based on resources, that people are going to be moving, but they're going to be moving to follow the packs of animals. They're going to be moving to places where the gathering is more plentiful. They're going to move based on food. That's the resource they're talking about. Stage 2 countries are tight, There's many people, there's a lot of young people, there's huge competition for jobs. Remember, economics is a major push and pull factor. And so in stage two, this is when you're going to see people leave internationally, right? That people are going to leave stage two countries and they're going to go into stage three or stage four countries, right? Stage three and stage four of the demographic transition sees different changes. You're going to see less people leaving internationally, many less people. You're not going to see the season mobility, but you're going to see internal migration. You're going to see movement, interregional migration. You see people moving from rural areas to urban areas. You're going to see people moving from the cities to the suburbs as well. As people have largely become urbanized in stage three and four countries, right? And you can see this again, there's the demographic transition, what's going on with the birth rate, the death rate, and the natural increase rate. You're going to see all sorts of how it translates into movement of people. All right, how far do migrants travel? That's a great question, right? So we start talking about voluntary migration versus forced migration. Right? And that's an interesting thing to think about, right? Because people who volunteer to move, right, there's choice in the matter, right? But many people don't have that option. They are forced to migrate, right? And we can talk about the indigenous movement of people off of the East Coast in the United States in the 1830s. The Trail of Tears, which you'll see here, indigenous nations like the Cherokee were relocated by force by our government to places like Oklahoma. We also look at the largest flow of migrants as well. We see Asia to Europe, Asia to North America, and Latin America to North America as well, right? So when we're talking about these international migration pieces, you have those two, right? Within internal migration, movement within a country, we see rural to urban, right, interregional happening. And again, this is much more common. People moving from place to place in a country is much more common than people moving from country to country. All right, we have inter, right, regional, from one region to one region. That tends to be rural to urban. But if people are moving within a region, that intra-regional, that's going to be urban to suburban in MDCs. People moving out of the cities and into the suburbs. We'll talk at the end of this about why that is, why people would move out of the city and into the suburbs. What advantages are there? Why do people seek that out? All right. So we look at global examples of forced migration. In the U.S., you definitely have slavery, right? That is a dictionary definition of forced migration. You have the Indian Removal Act, which we spoke to earlier, but also other places. You see the U.S., the Irish coming to the United States, largely due to the English making it very, very difficult to eke out a living. Now, there was nothing official about what the English did, but they just made the Irish very, very uncomfortable, I guess, when it came to the potato famine and all of these things. So you see a big push from the Irish coming to the United States, and we can look at English control of Ireland during that time. We see the British colonization of Australia, right? The Brits set up Australia to be a penal colony or a penalty or a prison colony, right? And they moved a lot of debtors and convicts there, right? So you didn't have to be convicted of a crime. You just had to be poor and behind and in debt, behind in your payments for the British government to ship you off to Australia. Right? We can also look at the Soviet Union or the USSR under the leadership of Joseph Stalin, shipping political prisoners. Anybody who there was a perception that they're going against the government would be shipped to work camps or gulags in Siberia. Good times. All right, there's the family memorial in Dublin, Ireland. Notice that people are not necessarily well fed in these statues. All right, what terms are associated with migration? We have the word emigration versus immigration. Emigrant immigrants are leaving a place, they're out, right? Or E for exit, versus immigrations who are coming in, right? I for in. So people emigrate from a spot, they immigrate to a spot. The difference between emigration and immigration is called net migration. So you have a net positive or a net negative, or net in migration versus net out. If you have net in migration, there are people coming to your country, more people are coming than leaving, right? And there's, if you have a net out migration, more people are leaving than are coming in. The United States has a net in migration, right? Stage 4 countries tend to do that. Developed countries tend to have net in migration. It's a place that people seek out, and there aren't that many people who leave. Keep in mind, there are people who do leave the United States every year, right? The U.S., again, has more foreign-born residents than anyone else. They have about 45 million, right? They do not have the highest percentage of foreign-born, though. That's Southwest Asian countries, and these are guest workers who are working in the oil industry. And we'll get more into guest workers as we move throughout this chapter. All right, so again, we look at receiving versus sending regions. We see a definite tie to development here. Asia, Latin America, and African regions are sending, right? And receiving would be developed places like Oceania, Europe, and North America, right? So we look at these largest three, right? Three patterns. Again, we can tie this to development, right? What explains these patterns? Development, right? People are going to seek out places where there's more economic opportunity, right? We look at the difference, migration to development, right? Their destination, we see countries of origin, Asia, Africa, Latin America, right? And then we see that shift as well, right? We look at the numbers going down. In Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and we see them going up in places like Europe, North America, and the South Pacific. Okay. Within international immigrants by state, we see a clear tie to the southern United States where jobs are plentiful. Also closer to Latin America, proximity will matter. Look at New York in terms of a population place, and New York City in particular as a destination for international immigrants. Right, we look at Minnesota and we see a breakdown there, right? 14% from Europe, and then we see the sending regions thrown in there as well. And we think of Europe, think of the Russian immigrants cluster in Shakopee as a good example of something next to you in your area, right? Immigrants by region of origin. If we look at the United States versus Minnesota, we see a higher percentage of Asian population, right? The Karen and the Hmong immigrant communities would explain a lot of that difference. Compared to Latin American folks, there are less percentage-wise, right? A higher percentage of African, and again, we look at our Somali community in this case, right? Europe stays about equal, others stay about equal as well, right? Percentage that are foreign born, again, we see clear clustering, right, in the cities, and we also have then Worthington down here, and Worthington has factory jobs, right? And so you're going to see a tie between economics here as well, right? So the Twin Cities, but then also that pull factor of economics, of jobs that are available, you're going to see down there. All right, here's 2010 immigration. Oh, we already covered that. All right, so let's talk a little bit about Europe. We are going to take an American lens on this because we live in America, and we're always going to try to compare things to America because it's something you understand more than other places in the world. What patterns of migration exist in Europe? We look at a disproportionate number of immigrants compared to the size, right? So only 10% of the world's population, but 30% of the world's immigrants are in Europe, all right? And then we also look at 60% of the 78 million immigrants come from other parts of Europe. So you're seeing a lot of movement within that. And that's explained by the European Union, right? The European Union is a large trade federation of most of the European countries, right? And they work very hard to distribute jobs across the board, from more industrial places to less industrial places. And you see a very uh, simplified system of movement if you are an EU country to another EU country. And when we look at Germany in particular, right, who has seen massive change in terms of the number of foreign-born people in their country. All right. One thing you really should know are the eras of immigration in the United States. This is something that you should memorize, to be quite honest, right? It's not something, it's something that the AP exam questions, these come up quite a bit. So we have three eras of immigration. The first one is colonial, the movement of English and maybe some Irish people, and then also the African American slave trade, right? That's what the first era would be, basically from those two areas. And then we get into more European settlement, and this happens right as a country hits stage two. Remember, stage two countries are very uncomfortable. There's a lot of young people, there's a lot of competition for jobs, so people are going to move away. We see this in Germany and Ireland in the 1840s and 50s, and also throughout the 1870s. Notice that there's a 10-year gap while we fought the Civil War. People don't tend to go to places that a Civil War is being fought. In the 1880s and the 1890s, we see Scandinavian people come. They start to settle in places like Minnesota. Hence, we have a team called the Minnesota Vikings that play football here. All right, so Sweden, Norway, and other parts of Scandinavia during the 1890s. And then we start to see an influx as stage two countries, as stage two hits Eastern and Southern Europe, we start to see an influx of Italians and Poles and Russians and Slavic-speaking people, right? And these folks are met with a little bit more resistance than their German and Irish counterparts. Keep in mind that there is a history, right, of whoever is the newest immigrant group to not be accepted, right? In the 1840s, there would be signs hanging in shops that said "Help wanted, Irish need not apply," right? Essentially saying we're looking to hire, but we're not going to hire you if you're Irish. You see this backlash happen against the Southern and Eastern European people as well. They are a little darker in complexion. They are not speaking Romance languages as much. And they are largely Catholic compared to Protestant, so there's some biases that happen there, right? And so think about this as the second rise of the Ku Klux Klan happens during this time. In the Ku Klux Klan, clearly we have the ties to racism against African Americans, but they were a little bit more inclusive in that they did not like anybody they didn't like Catholics, they didn't like foreigners. They preferred people to be whiter and more Protestant. Right? And then our third, right? So you notice the 1920s, after the 1924, the door kind of slammed shut, and we actually have an official policy. There is no official policy during this time, during the first two eras. And we start to see quotas and limitations happening. From the 1950s, notice that the 30s and the 40s, during the Great Depression and also the World War II era, you don't see a lot of movement happening, right? But our third era is LDC settlement. We see Asia places and Latin America, and then increasingly African countries as well. All right, so there is your waves of immigration, right? We see European that happening all the way up until the 1930s, and then we see that slowly disappearing. We see the rise in the 1950s of Latin American and Asian populations, right? And increasingly African as well. All right, we look at our interregional patterns. This stuff is something to think about. We're going to go over it quickly. Colonial settlement, right? From 1790, we see the population center shifting, right? From there, we get across the interior settlement, across the Appalachian Mountains, and then we move further west with Manifest Destiny, which is kind of generally a racist policy that says God has made it our destiny, right, to go from coast to coast. And this was a philosophy that basically allowed us to justify pushing indigenous people off of their lands and keep pushing and pushing and pushing. The gold rush doesn't hurt things when it comes to manifest destiny. And so we have this opening up of the West, right? And then we swing back and hit the Great Plains. And this is where Minnesota, right, where we start to see the Scandinavian populations come through. Note that technology, railroads in particular, help push that as well, right? And in each case, in these up until 1940, we start to see it's always a push west, 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 and more west, right? From the 1950s on, though, we start to see this southern trend. So there you have it, right? We have all of these different pieces. Right? We keep going west and west and west, but in the 1950s, we start to see a southern trend as well. We'll talk more about why you would put a factory in the South in 2020. We can talk about the aging population and movement of people of retirement from the Midwest, people who don't want to shovel snow anymore. We can talk about a lot of factors that go with that. Right? So we see a shift from the Rust Belt, these areas here, right? And jobs are more plentiful now in the Sun Belt. Factories are more likely to open down there. They're less unionized. More of this when we talk about industry. All right. Notice that we see a shift, right? The difference between 1995 and 2010. Right. Note the difference between these. This is an important map reading skill. Right. The difference between 1995 and 2010, and the lines, the sheer number of people moving. In 1995, and the reason for this is 1995, the economy was booming. Right. Jobs were very plentiful. The housing market was wide open. People didn't have problems finding places to stay nor securing employment in 1995. 2010, we're coming out of that recession, right? And you see less movement from places to places, right? Notice that we also see distance decay, right, as we move through, that people are more likely to move to places that are next to them, right, as opposed to places like here, right, and here, and less likely to move from places from the west to the east coast, right? Start to see that, right? Other examples of interregional migration in other large countries, we see the Chinese moving towards coastal cities, looking for industrial jobs, moving off of rice farms and into industrialized places. Massive movements of people going on right now as we speak. Brazil made a big push in a government policy to move people into the interior and off of the coast. They even moved their capital, and we call this a forward capital, move Brasilia to the middle of the country, right, and basically carved it out of the Amazon rainforest. Canada, we see patterns are going to be similar movement, westward movement, kind of like the U.S., right? And then in Russia, we see Russification happening here. The reversal of earlier attempts. We see anti-Russification. There was much movement within the Soviet Union, moving Russians, the culturally Russian people, ethnic Russians to the Asian parts of the Soviet Union. There was a shift after the Soviet Union collapsed. You see Russian people moving back to more Russian areas. All right. Again, we look at increase. You see loss in these areas. You see increase along the industrial coast, where your garment factories are, and your cheap electronic and plastic stuff. You see a movement here, right? Gains in terms of gaining into the interior off of the northeast coast in the Bahia region. All right. So again, we see this movement, this carved out city. We'll see more of that later on as we move throughout this class. We see interregional, again, net migration. We see losses from the east, and we see increased movement towards the west. Right? We see that as well in Russia. All right, one word that we didn't talk about is Russification. It's a policy that tried to assimilate all people to be more Russian throughout the Soviet Union. And the Soviets would move 30 million Russians to other parts of the Soviet regions, right? And again, you see that counter migration that happened after 1991. All right. Looking at our most common patterns of intra-regional migration, so within a region, in the world, the number one is people moving from rural to urban. All right. We see this rapid growth, rapid urbanization in LDCs or developing regions today. All right. If we are talking about MDCs or developed regions, the most common pattern is urban to suburban, people moving out of the cities and moving into the suburbs. And we'll talk more about that in our next couple slides, but think about this. Why would you rather live in the suburbs? What's good about the suburbs? You all live in the suburbs, right? I myself live in Minneapolis. So what would be something that you could convince me, what would you say to convince me to come out and live in the suburbs? What's going on there? What's good? Why are people moving there? Right? We also have a third trend, which is much smaller, right? And that is urban to rural, and this is called counter-urbanization. And this comes with mobility of job, right? That people who can work at home oftentimes choose to move out of urban or suburban areas and move to the countryside, right? And choose to raise their kids in small towns to get away from the fast-paced urban or suburban lifestyle and move to a slower-paced country lifestyle. And if you can work from anywhere, people are choosing to do that. So that's a small trend. It's amongst the middle and upper class. And keep in mind, particularly in COVID, that being tied to a location for your job, as I'm teaching you from home, right, becomes much less static. Could I be teaching you from Rhode Island right now? I probably could. I'm not going to, but I probably could. So we do see a trend, right, happening there. All right. Other things to think about, islands of development. These are pull factors, right? Cities in developing worlds, they are usually ports. You see lots of foreign investment, you see available jobs, you see factories, you see infrastructure happening there, and you see that less so in the interior of countries. Nigeria is a great example. Nigeria is fascinating in terms of its place. If there was one country that we could only use the scale of a country, and we had to study all of our topics in AP Human Geography, Nigeria would be the one, right? It has different agricultural pieces, it has ethnic and political problems and issues, it has religious differences, it has linguistic differences, and it also has many different development areas, right? And so we look at this area right in here where the oil is concentrated, and this is an island of development, right? And poor people from interior Nigeria are going to be moving here, and that puts a strain on the poor areas as well because you see a loss of bodies happening there. All right. Again, we look at movement. We see movement from the cities to the suburbs, right? You don't see nearly as much happening there, right? And you see a little bit of counter migration as well, right? People coming from non-metropolitan to metropolitan. All right. See population change, right? We see percent change happening in the suburbs right in here, less so in Minneapolis, St. Paul. There's clear looks at this as well. You see that happening. All right, so why move, right? And sometimes we call the movement to the suburbs, we sometimes call that sprawl because it happens so fast, and it's sometimes disorganized and it tends to sprawl out or move a little too rapidly, and it's not necessarily as organized as we want, right? But we look at this. In the 1950s, we have something called the baby boom, right? And all of a sudden, these small Minneapolis homes aren't going to house as many children as are in the homes. And so there's a push for bigger houses, right? And those are being built outside of the Minneapolis and St. Paul land. It's being places like Richfield or Edina or Cottage Grove or Woodbury, right? So you see this increase. You actually see a decrease in Minneapolis population throughout the 60s and 70s as the rise of the suburbs. The second reason why the suburbs grow, it has to do with transportation, and it has to do with the interstate highways happening. President Eisenhower puts in the interstates, which really open up, makes it a lot easier for people to move from the city, to be living in the cities, but still work in the city, but live in a place like Richfield. When 35W comes in, all of a sudden you're 10 minutes away from your downtown office via car, right? Keep in mind, we also have automobiles happening during this time as well. This is the time where the middle class really become automobile friendly. Right, that most people by the time the 70s are over, despite wealth, have a car. Right, again, we look at percent changes happening, right? We see that happening around as well. Right, we also see the rise of poverty in the suburbs. Right, that jobs, our entry-level jobs are opening up in the suburbs. So think about this in terms of your Chick-fil-A or your Cane's, right? You don't see a lot of that, either one of those in Minneapolis and St. Paul. You tend to see them scattered around. And that's because the demand is greater in the suburbs. So you see people moving to the suburbs. You see services then moving to the suburbs as well. And those service sector jobs open up, and so people who are relying on those jobs tend to move closer to their jobs as well. So you start to see a trend of poverty in the suburbs. We don't think of this. We tend to think of the suburbs as much more affluent than the inner city, right? But we see this growth happening. All right, we start to see it here in this, and we start to see change in poor population, right? And in Hennepin County, definitely, right? And there, but we also see Dakota right in here, which is a suburban county, right? And Anoka County, right? And Ramsey and Washington as well. All right, and that again is tied to growth jobs, right? So we see gains in areas like Woodbury, right? And Inver Grove Heights and Eagan and Apple Valley. We start to see these jobs becoming more plentiful.